Hello everybody, thanks for joining. My name is Scott. I work at Nagoya Gakuin University, and today I'm going to be talking about how to develop a conversation-focused strategy curriculum in your classroom, in your institution. Okay, so a little bit about my history. So I worked for 5 years at a conversation school as a teacher. Then I moved to university where I was studying and was also a tutor and administrator on the university's conversation course called the Power Up Tutorial Program. In 2018, I became a lecturer at Nagoya Gakuin University, where I specialize in English conversation, and my PhD is also focused on conversation, interaction. So let's start with the basics. What is a communication strategy, really? So in 1980, Canal and Swain came up with this great idea of communicative competence. So they looked at grammatical competence, sociolinguistic competence, and strategic competence. A strategic one is the one we really want to think about for strategy. So here's an example of a conversation. So A says, do you have a dog? B doesn't understand something here, so they say, what? A says, do you have a dog? In Japanese, it's inu. B says, oh, okay, yes, I do. So that moment there when B doesn't understand, so the conversation kind of breaks, they say what? That's a conversation strategy. So that's what the conversation strategies originally were conceived of being. It was ways to repair or to avoid breaks in conversation. But those have expanded a lot over time. So nowadays we talk about all kinds of things with conversation strategies. In fact, almost everything in an interaction can be considered a strategy in some form. So Young in 2011 talked about interactional competence, so identity resources, linguistic resources, and interactional resources. Conversation strategies do occur for all of these, but in particular we see a lot of them come from interactional resources, so speech acts, which is chunks of conversation or special phrases with a particular usage. Then we've got turn taking, so figuring out, who's speaking now. And we've got the repair, and also boundaries, so things like changing topics, ending conversations, beginning conversations, that kind of thing. Transitioning. Why teach strategies? So I think soccer is a really good, or any sport really is a really good way to think about this. So you can read all the books in the world about soccer, and you can have incredible knowledge about how soccer works, but that on its own is not going to turn you into someone who can play soccer. In order to be able to play it, you need this. You need practice. You need experience. You need to figure out how to do all these little actions that make the wider soccer player competence. And the same with strategies. So what strategies are? They are these little things that we need to do in a conversation in order to become competent in the wider interaction. So that's really what the strategies are. It's this kind of practical understanding of how to navigate conversations. How many strategies are there? A lot. I don't think anybody knows how many. Kint's textbook, which is my favorite textbook to use, but it's difficult to get hold of, from 2005, lists 43, but he has 2 textbooks. If you would like to pick up a textbook that includes strategies already, Nice Talking With You and Touchstone are 2 kind of general English textbooks that include strategies in them. And then there's Keying Key's Conversation Strategies book, which has a big list of strategies and recommended activities that you can use to teach them. So it's good if you just want to kind of pop strategies straight into what you're already doing. So maybe before we go further, it's good to talk about just some of the basics of foreign language course design. So first and possibly most importantly, the Atlas complex. So Atlas was the Greek god who held up the world. and here's Atlas in the classroom. So a lot of teachers have a little bit of difficulty because they feel that they need to be in control and they need to be making everything happen. Everything's got to go through them. That's an Atlas complex. The kind of teacher who worries that everything rests on their shoulders. So we want to move away from that and move to things like group activities, pair work, maybe self-assessment, things that allow students to become more autonomous, take responsibility, and take control of their own learning. Thinking about assessment, we're all familiar with this, with the tests, assessment of learning, trying to find out how good students are. There's also assessment for learning. So that's the assessments that we use not to grade, but to find out how students are doing and try and figure out ways to help them improve more. So actually, assessment of and assessment for might be the same thing. And then we've got assessment as learning, where we're trying to help the students to help themselves, really. How can we do that? So here's an example of something we might do, some kind of like self-review activity, for example. So in an assessment, we probably want to have all three of these. We want to have a focus on communicative language teaching. We want the main goal of the course probably that at the end of it, students can communicate in their target language. Thinking about the actual course goals and lesson goals, we need goals that are appropriate, communication focused. Probably want to focus on the 4 strands, so speaking, listening, reading, writing. And they also want to be practical, right? It needs to be goals that can be done. Lesson structure. So we talked a little bit about Atlas, and kind of related to that is we can almost think of time that the teacher spends talking as wasted time. That's not always true, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. So particularly all the time that the teacher has to explain how to do activities, that's basically wasted time, right? So we're trying to move away a little bit from that. So we want to try and make lesson structures that are maybe quite simple, regular, and that encourage the teacher to be a facilitator and a kind of manager of the classroom rather than like a lecturer. So cognitive load, also important. We don't want to overload students so that they can't learn or get a fear of learning. So trying to teach new languages and new concepts at the same time tends to lead to overload. So we want to go for this Goldilocks zone below. So new language connecting to things that students already know, or the opposite, using language that students already know, but maybe introducing new ways of using it, new concepts. So with conversation strategies, probably most of the time we're trying to aim for this bottom one, right? We're trying to give students new ways of navigating the conversation using language that they mostly already have. We probably need to include some kind of spaced repetition in there. So Lightburn and Spotter said that we need at least 16 in-context exposures to new language in order to be able to use it productively on average, possibly more than that. And we also need to remember that people forget things. Okay, so probably we also want some kind of professional development in our curriculums, right? So maybe a teaching journal. We can think about things that worked, things that didn't work, our ideas. If possible, classroom recordings are fantastic, really, really deep, interesting data that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. But of course, we need to think about permission, practical issues, time issues. And we've got to actually take the time out to like watch these videos and probably transcribe them too. Observation is a really great kind of halfway house. So we can find another teacher, we can observe each other, we can share feedback with each other. Maybe we can share what we learned in staff meetings, start to create a culture of improvement, an open culture of improvement. So what do my courses look like? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about older course from 2017, and then I'll also talk about like kind of some issues that came up regarding that course, and then I'll compare that with the course that I currently teach now. So here is the first semester from that 2017 course. Here's what the curriculum looked like. So every week the students studied a conversation strategy, actually usually two strategies, but the lesson title was one. So the blue indicates repair strategies. The white is strategies intended to kind of make conversations longer, more interesting, more smooth, kind of conversation expansion strategies. And the two grey ones at the end are filler lessons, basically. Here's what an old lesson plan looked like. So 45-minute class, usually only 3 to 6 students per teacher. It's kind of a special class, special course. The green activities are the regular activities that were the same every week. So the beginning, create a goal, do a review activity. At the end, have a conversation, and then do a self-review activity. And then in between that, in the middle of the sandwich, they did usually 2 conversation strategies. So in the case of this example, they have a couple of activities related to the +1 rule, which is basically speaking for longer, saying more, and then open questions. And yeah, similar kind of activities. So an example, maybe a discussion of how they work, and then some kind of practice. But there were some issues with that course. So from recording and transcribing a couple of the lessons, I found that there were basically students rarely use repair, like almost never. So in that case, why do we have 4 repair lessons if students don't use it? They're a little bit and wasted is not the right word, but 4 is maybe too many for strategies that they don't really use very much. Also, I found that there were some parts of the conversation where it was clear that students lacked a strategy because they hadn't been taught it, and so the conversation was like maybe breaking down a little bit or turning into Japanese, or the opposite. They were finding ways to continue a conversation using strategies that we hadn't taught, but maybe we should, so that all students could know these strategies. From being observed by the teachers, particularly during my MA, by my advisors, found that the lessons were too shallow. Basically, lots of short, fast activities, just boom, 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 but without kind of deep learning. Also, lots of different activities every week, so a lot of time spent with the teacher talking about how to do things. It's kind of a waste, right? Just from my journal and just kind of my experiences in the classes, I found that there's a cognitive overload issue, kind of probably related to the shallowness of the lessons. Like they're doing lots of stuff, they're trying to learn 2 different strategies in one lesson, in one 45-minute lesson. The review is a little bit shallow. A lot of teachers didn't do it because they didn't have time, because there were so many activities. Lack of personalization in the lessons. Everything was kind of mostly decided apart from like the final activity, really. And we had those 2 kind of filler lessons that were kind of waste, right? So this is what my curriculum looks like this year. So again, 15 lessons, but the first thing you might notice is that there are only 2 repairs this time. So I just include the 2 that are probably most useful for students, and then 2 again in the next semester. Also, instead of filler classes, we now have tests. So a mid-semester test and a final test. There's a lot of debate around the use of tests, but I would say that they can provide positive washback if they're set up right, which I'll talk about in a minute. And they also provide opportunities for students and the teacher to find out where they're at and what they need to do. And also these green days, which are essentially review days, where students can look at recordings taken from their classes and they can self-analyze. And that's a really good way for them to find out what they need to do next. And also just a general review day. So here's what the speaking test rubric looks like for that mid-semester test. So students get to see this early on in the semester, so they kind of have an idea of exactly what they need to learn. So it's basically it's the strategies plus fluency. New lesson plans look like this. So now my lessons are 90 minutes instead of 45, but it's usually just me with 25 to 30 students, so quite different. And you can see here, essentially every activity is the same basic structure week to week. The innards are a little different, but the structure is basically the same. So the amount of explaining I have to do is just by week 4, I almost don't have to explain anything. The students can basically run the class by themselves. And I'm free to go around and help them and talk with individuals. So the way it works is the students are given an example dialogue, and I explain today's strategy a little bit. We talk about it. Maybe we talk about some of the language that maybe they have trouble with in this dialogue. Next, they work in pairs to create their own dialogue, their own original dialogue, and they can create it however they want. The only requirement is that they use today's new strategy in it somewhere. They record it so that they can maybe listen later. Next, they take 10 or 15 minutes to create a conversation card. So I'll show you what it looks like later, but basically it's a piece of card about this big that students can write down things they want to talk about. They can write down some useful phrases, maybe some pictures. That way it's going to be easier for them to have conversations in the target language. Then we do these recursive conversations. So that's 3 conversations with 3 different partners. And then there's a self-review activity at the end. So here's an example lesson. So this is kind of debatable whether you need both the target language and the native language in materials. My students right now are generally quite low level, so I tend to include dual language materials, but it's definitely debatable. So there's this conversation here, which is different every week, but the same basic structure, right? There are lines between each line so that students can write their own notes. And what you might not notice just from looking at this is that actually past strategies and future strategies are included every week in the dialogues. So that way they're getting constant re-exposure to things. So although the topic's changing and the content of the conversations are changing, the strategies are always there. So the students are constantly seeing how these strategies can be used. So in this particular lesson, the main focus strategy is how about you. That's the strategy they're focusing on, but there are lots of other things in there. And interesting thing I found is that students start to use strategies that they haven't even studied yet, just because they see them in the dialogue, because they start to understand how they're used a little bit. So they're kind of pre-studying without even knowing it, really. Next, the students, so they usually work in pairs to make their own dialogue, maybe a group of 3. Then they record it. Then they make these conversation cards that I talked about. Then they talk with 3 different partners. I do maybe a little bit of review in between, maybe give them some advice. And then they do a little self-review with some positive psychology, talk about what they did well, what their partners did well, and talk a little about what they want to improve. So just to summarize, for developing a communication strategy focused curriculum, when you think about the strategies, the assessment rubric, do we want to include review days, professional development in the curriculum? At the lesson level, are they regular, simple? Do they include a lot of review and callback? And are they personalizable by the students? Okay, thank you very much. If you'd like to contact me, there's my email. And here are some useful references for you. And these are all of the wonderful images that I borrowed from the nice people on the internet. Okay, thank you very much.